This is Charlie Crockett, Texas musician and descendant of Davy Crockett, inviting you to visit the Alamo. It's not the same Alamo you, remember. There's lots of new things to experience, like the 500 artifacts inside the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center, the new Mission Gate and Lunette outdoor exhibit, and Surrounded, the Alamo Augmented Experience. It's all part of an ongoing restoration and expansion that will write the Alamo's next chapter. So don't wait. Plan your visit today at thealamo.org.
Stories bigger than Texas, the Alamo podcast. Here at the Alamo, we believe all history is connected. That's why we're taking you to Louisiana, where 210 years ago this week, some 2 decades before the Battle of the Alamo, a struggle between two nations helped set the stage for conflicts to come. Today we reveal what led to the Battle of New Orleans, what the American victory there represented for what would become the state of Texas, and the fireside chat taking place this week at the Alamo to bring this history full circle. I'm your host, Emily Balcom. We're joined by Ernesto Rodriguez, the Alamo Senior Curator, Historian, and Lecturer. Thank you for coming back on the podcast.
It's my pleasure, Emily.
The Battle of New Orleans takes place in January 1815 as the War of 1812 was ending. Remind our listeners, what was the War of 1812 about?
So the War of 1812 came about as a result of American shipping being stopped by British forces because they were involved in the fight against France. They decided that they would try to stop any trade with France, and France also did their own thing to go against us. It really started to boil over when the British Navy would commandeer ships and take Americans and press them into service. And so that's what really started to spur the Americans here to think about war.
As we're going to learn through this conversation, the Battle of New Orleans, despite its name, really circles back to our story here at the Alamo.
Yes, it does. It's one of those battles and wars in general that sets the stage of what will happen in Texas. Men that fight in the War of 1812 will end up in Texas, and they will end up playing their role. You have Milam, who will lead the charge in the Battle of Bear. You have Sam Houston, who will then become not only the hero at San Jacinto, but the first president of the Republic of Texas. You have these men that served that bring that experience of war into Texas.
We're seeing several countries fight over Louisiana. What is at stake specifically with Louisiana?
It is the port and it is the mouth of the Mississippi River. And if you control the entrance to the Mississippi River, you control all trade coming and going.
There were concerns that Britain and Spain wanted to reclaim territories of the Louisiana Purchase because they did not recognize land deals that Napoleon made.
That's a big fear. The result is that you control the port, you control what comes and goes. And New Orleans is a very important city. It is an international destination. And it will be the place where people will meet to discuss other wars that will happen. It's a very strategic place, and everyone wants control of it.
In January 1815, it feels like the War of 1812 has officially ended. Just days before the new year began, a treaty was even signed to end the war. What was this treaty?
The Treaty of Ghent. It was signed in Ghent in Belgium. What had happened was there was attempts earlier to do something in Russia. That fell apart. They ended up in Ghent. And what the treaty, what they came up with was basically stopping hostilities. They also had this really interesting clause, and it was both nations would try to work to abolish slavery. And it's one of those really interesting things because this is 1814, and they're discussing that topic on how to end it, and that both nations would come together to try to stop it.
But behind the scenes, there's a British government official who has secretly ordered the war to continue, even if there were rumors of peace.
Yes, because the goal is to control that Mississippi River, because it is the bloodline for Canada. Canada is one of the territories that was still owned by Great Britain, and it was one of the other flashpoints for this conflict. There had been a comment that had been made that Canada could be taken by the United States, and as a result, a group of men decided to take it upon themselves to attack Canada. There was this threat as well with the Native American groups, Tecumseh and the Prophet, and they basically went into Tippecanoe and destroyed that. And so these hostilities, if you don't stop the movement of people up the Mississippi River. You don't control that. This can continue. And Canada was one of those places where the Mississippi River runs straight to it. And so there's a direct line of attack. And so you want to make sure you can prevent that. And the only way to do so is take care of the mouth.
New Orleans. So what's happening in the run-up to the Battle of New Orleans? There's a fleet of British ships in the Gulf of Mexico.
There's a fleet of ships in the Gulf of Mexico, and they're prepping for an attack. What they're doing is they're trying to figure out how to offload the troops in order for them to take the city. They start movements in late December, and things don't go the way that they have planned. Their commanders, their plan is to have ladders and to have fascines, which are makeshift barricade-type devices. They're circular, and they can be used to climb on. And so that's the plan because the Americans are entrenched in a plantation outside New Orleans, and they're using a lot of the little swamps and the canals as basically defensive positions, and the British are supposed to try to get across that.
They're trying to ferry into the bayou by whatever means possible.
Yes, they are. And unfortunately, they're also on flat land out in the open, which is one of the things you never want to do is fight an entrenched group from the open.
Andrew Jackson gets word about this.
Yes, he does. And he starts setting up a line of defenses. You know, this is a line that is made up of Army, militia, Tennesseans, Kentuckians, and their goal is to stop them from reaching New Orleans.
There's a skirmish, really inconclusive, kind of ends in a draw. So the Americans start building this earthwork called Line Jackson. What is this earthwork made out of, and what does this line represent?
That line of basically earthenwork, which is dirt and other things, the debris, is the last defensive position that you can have to prevent the movement. Now, there's two columns, right? There's the 1st Division, 2nd Division, the one that is under Jackson's control, and then there's one that's a little further back. And the thing is, if the first line falls, the second will hopefully hold them off. Well, the first line does not fall. That's one of the things the British are not expecting.
It runs perpendicular from the Mississippi River to a cypress swamp for 3/4 of a mile.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so you have to think about regular Army tactics. They're fighting in what they call linear warfare, so they're all in a line. They're moving across this field in a line towards basically danger. And again, they're out in the open. You're a target. Some of the fighting is basically the men are killed by rifle fire, which is a lot more accurate. A lot of these men that were involved in this battle had fought with Wellington. They were hardened soldiers, but they were not accustomed to having rifle fire come at you from men that were hunters. It was a total disarray of the British Army. They did everything wrong that you can imagine, unfortunately. You know, they fought out in the open. They're fighting against a group of men that are protected.
By January 8th, 1815, the Battle of New Orleans is underway. It starts before sunrise, about 5 miles southeast of the French Quarter.
Commander Pakenham is prepping his troops, and the idea is that they're going to do a full frontal assault, which is one of those things you don't do in this type of situation. He believes that his men are prepared, that they have brought all the necessary supplies, but he soon realizes they have not. And they begin to move forward. He's wounded. His horse is killed from under him. And he jumps on another horse and he continues to lead the charge. And then he is soon met with more fire. He is mortally wounded. He'll be dragged to a grove of trees where he will die. His subordinates will then take over, and one by one, the officers are killed. And the line stands firm along the Jackson line as they're holding them back. This battle does not go as planned for the British.
But the British had 8,000 forces. The Americans had 5,700. So just by numbers, you'd think the British would have it.
You would think so, but this is one of those things that when you are on an open field and the enemy is not, when the enemy has rifles, they're using them in the most effective manner possible. It changes the tide. And they're also firing artillery. So there's canister shot. You know, you name it, it's coming at you. There's an account of an officer actually making it to the top one of the parapets and cheering and then getting killed immediately. So it turns into disarray. When you lose all your commanders, morale is not at its highest, and people start falling back, including those hardened men that had fought with Wellington start to fall back.
A soldier from Kentucky later wrote, When the smoke had cleared and we could obtain a fair view of the field, it looked at first glance like a sea of blood. It was not blood itself, but the red coats in which the British soldiers were dressed. The field was entirely covered in prostrate bodies.
Yeah, it is a bloody battle. It's hard to believe that that could happen to one of the best armies in the world, especially since there's one account from someone else in one of these battles in the War of 1812 where a gentleman encounters Winfield Scott's group, and he says, they are not militiamen, they're regulars because they're trained. And that's what the British were not ready for. You know, when you have these stories of the militiaman, the Minuteman coming up, and all of a sudden you encounter a group of people that are actually trained and ready to stand firm, it changes the way that you see this combat. You see them now as not as a rabble, but as a force to be reckoned with.
Looking at the casualties, the Americans have anywhere from 60 to 70 soldiers killed or wounded, while the British have more than 2,000. And this all took place in less than 30 minutes.
Yeah, it's amazing what not having protection will do. And the British learned really fast that you need to be under cover, and they are not.
What does the American victory in the Battle of New Orleans represent?
It represents the end, basically, of any chance of Great Britain reclaiming any part of the United States. So it sets us as our own nation now, truly. You know, our Navy had done its great job, and it's a War of 1812 is a birth of the U.S. Navy, you know, with the USS Constitution gaining its nickname Old Ironsides from several encounters that it had. And so you think about that, it puts our Navy up against the British Navy, one of the best in the world, the U.S. forces up against British forces, best in the world. And so it sets this tone for a free America.
There's a significant impact on Texas history by freeing Americans to expand west, and that sets the stage for the annexation of Texas.
With this battle and the fact that now the United States truly controls Louisiana and the fact that people start moving west, it leads to Texas becoming colonized by Americans and other European nations. It leads to Texas Revolution, and then it leads eventually to the Mexican-American War, which will end with the United States fulfilling manifest destiny, right? Sea to shining sea. So all these events are connected, and they all play a role in setting the stage for the United States being basically the entire center part of the continent. And it's one of those things that unless you look at all these pieces, you can't put the puzzle together.
The Battle of New Orleans makes Andrew Jackson a hero. It also involves people who will become central to the Alamo story, and some of them fought under Jackson.
Yeah, Sam Houston fought under Jackson. Crockett makes his name as a scout in fighting during this period. And so these are men that will become prominent during that era. This is a time when there's so many things that are new. And when you look west, there's this new thing on the horizon. And as Americans during this period, you're always looking for better opportunity. And Texas will become that next opportunity for many.
You mentioned earlier in the episode, Benjamin Rush Milam was in the Battle of New Orleans.
Yeah, Benjamin Rush Milam was at the Battle of New Orleans, and he's one of those men that you look at and go, it's an impressive person that decides that this idea of freedom, of the American idea of a republic is so important that he goes south and continues fighting. And then he will be the gentleman that leads the charge at the Battle of Bear, which is a very important thing. And, you know, we are lucky that the Alamo and its collection has a portrait of Benjamin Rush Milam done in life. He's a very important figure that needs his due when people see that he had an important role. James Clinton Neal, you know, was involved in the War of 1812. He will be the commander of the Alamo prior to the battle, and he leaves Travis as in charge when he leaves the site. He will be at the skirmish on the 20th of April, 1836, before the Battle of San Jacinto, and he's wounded. He's an artilleryman. So this is another person that is an important figure that learned how to do the task of an officer during the War of 1812.
They earned their stripes.
Yes, they did.
Tomorrow night, January 10th, you and some friends will be holding a fireside chat in the Living History encampment here at the Alamo, all about the Battle of New Orleans, filled with conversations and storytelling around the campfire. We do still have some tickets left that I'll be linking to in the podcast notes. Tell us about the event.
The event will be a sort of a fireside chat, and we will hang out and we'll discuss the Battle of New Orleans and its impact on not only the United States, but Texas, and how that day, January 8th, would be a day that would be celebrated for a while, even with more gusto than July 4th.
The way we celebrate July 4th today, that's how people used to celebrate January 8th.
Yes, they did. And it's because that's such a decisive point in which we were now truly free of Great Britain.
There's a song from 1959 called The Battle of New Orleans. Tell us about it.
It tells the entire story of the battle, but in song. It's like a long poem. It's a great song that taught many people about the Battle of New Orleans that unfortunately most people don't know about today. You know, there's other songs that pop up about that are important to this period. There's the Hunters of Kentucky, because the Hunters of Kentucky make a name for themselves in the War of 1812.
But the most famous song from this period is
A poem written by Francis Scott Key.
not about the Battle of New Orleans, but during the War of 1812.
The fight for Fort McHenry, the Star-Spangled Banner. That would become one of the most important poems written and put into song, which is our own national anthem.
Ernesto Rodriguez, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Be sure to check out the podcast notes where we've linked to the American Battlefield Trust's detailed synopsis of the tactics used at the Battle of New Orleans, plus how you can join Ernesto here at the Alamo tomorrow night, January 10th, for a fireside chat all about the Battle of New Orleans. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.